Jarod Facundo and Luke Goldstein, writing fellows at the American Prospect, who wrote about and have been covering the Chicago mayoral race. Thanks so much, guys, for coming on today.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Yeah, so here we go. Big news now. Brandon Johnson officially defeated Paul Vallas. Despite Vallas outspending Brandon Johnson 2-1, being backed by the Fraternal Order of Police, the police union, the Chamber of Commerce in the state, comparing that to Brandon Johnson, who was a teachers union organizer backed by the Chicago Teachers Union, county commissioner, Working Families Party candidate. The difference could not have been starker. What are your immediate takeaways from this great victory, honestly, for progressives in the city of Chicago?
Yeah, so, I mean, this is a huge upset victory for Brandon Johnson. And I think this is definitely a blow to the, sort of more conservative corporate wing of the Democratic Party, which has continually tried to use fears about crime and capital flight as well to stymie progressive candidates. And it didn't work here. Brandon Johnson ran an unabashedly left-wing campaign with union support. He ran on a pretty ambitious set of policy ideas to, reinvest in public education, reinvest in social programs, and also to implement a wealth tax to fund various projects and invest in affordable housing.
Yeah, go ahead, Jarod.
The subtext of everything that Luke is saying is that this is pushing against the Chicago political establishment. Like, I think that's probably the biggest takeaway from all of this is that when it comes to like Brandon Johnson, like his base did not the coalition that brought him to victory wasn't like natural or set from the beginning. Like he really had to assemble or like tap into the CTU's campaign infrastructure to really like turn out the vote in his favor. And being able to do that, going from like not having like the name recognition or I guess the career that Paul Vallas did in such a short amount of time really is a testament to the strength of his campaign.
Yeah, and I mean, Jarod, he started at 3% in the early rounds of voting, and he had not a ton of name recognition, and yet he was able to quickly build coalitions to advance to the runoff. I mean, how did he even get to the runoff election? When there were a lot, of course, he was running against an incumbent. The field was so crowded. There were others positioning themselves as progressives, but, we're not going to go as far on crime and stuff. How did he stand out in that field?
Yeah, Luke, I think because you covered the primary at first. So
Luke, go ahead.
Right. Yeah. So it was a really interesting dynamic for this general race because basically in the runoff, both Brandon Johnson and Paul Vallas, drew their main support from the north side of the city, by and large. And that is more so the, affluent and kind of higher educated part of the city, which is to be expected for the primary race. Like those are, higher propensity voters. Yeah. But the same for the general election. Brandon Johnson ran the best ground game of all the candidates and tapped into this organizing infrastructure that the Chicago Teachers Union and also the Working Families chapter, United Working Families in the city, had been really building for decades. And, took some, took kind of, riskier policy strategies. He ran on police reform and other progressive candidates, for example, like Congressman Chuy Garcia actually tried to kind of tack to the right with a sort of, more conservative policy of a greater police presence. And that really ended up only pushing more voters to Paul Vallas.
So that's the thing I mean, we're on the national level. I'll make this case a lot where Democrats try to appeal to right-wing talking points sometimes in certain congressional races. And my point is always, if people want Republican, they're going to go with the real thing, not the Democrat that's saying the Republican thing. And that kind of seemed to work, at least in Vallas's favor, to have him stand out. If you want to be a tough on crime vote, if you're a tough on crime voter, you were going to go to Vallas. And so do you think that for the rest of the candidates that didn't feed into that really benefited Brandon Johnson and allowed him to move forward into the 1v1 race that ended up in his victory yesterday?
I think, like, in respects to crime, like, voters were probably able to oversee what could be perceived as like a weak stance on being tough on crime, that like voters really aren't single issue sort of people. That, like, I think if you taken some what Brandon Johnson was offering, his platform of, like, I don't know, like treatment over trauma and prioritizing like economic investment through like social programs and promoting public education, that the combination of those things, like whatever reservations people might have about crime, especially on in like the Black neighborhoods and Latino neighborhoods where crime is experienced most heavily, the other things outweighed what the message that Vallas was trying to sell. So I don't know, it's one of those things like where I love election day, because it really like puts every single person in their place to really just see how people like land on the candidates, and it kind of just shows how we can't flatten how people might think about issues.
Right. And just to kind of go off that also, I mean, you know, if you paid attention to any national headlines for either the primary or the general runoff, you know, you knew that most voters in Chicago said that public safety was their top concern. And people translated that as meaning, you know, we want tough on crime policies. That was at least the kind of forecast, you know. And, you know, Brandon Johnson outperformed in the primary and then in the general. And it's largely because, you know, that kind of mistranslation of what people meant by public safety is our top issue. You know, we spoke to voters on the ground for the piece that we wrote. And, you know, some of them would say, I actually like what Vallas says on crime, but there are other issues that are really important to me, you know, like education. And that's why I'm ultimately going to vote for Johnson.
Well, that was part of Johnson's strategy as well, right? I mean, you wrote about this, as you say, in your piece, about how, yes, crime or public safety was on the top of people's priority list, but he was seemingly effective in reframing the public safety issue to one where he was pitching voters on economic policies that would raise the standard of living in Chicago, and education, as you say. What were some of the strategies that you observed that Johnson deployed, and Jarod, I'll turn to you on this, that you feel might have been most effective in turning out the voters that he needed to end up victorious yesterday?
I think it really goes back to this ground game. Like, we were talking to some of the organizers that really like tapped into like these Latino neighborhoods. I think the big takeaway there is I won't. Okay, before that, I won't even lie that the narrative that Brandon Johnson initially put out of trying to address the root causes of poverty, I didn't know, or I didn't suspect that it would have as much leeway and buy-in from voters, just because I think typically that Paul Vallas was able to really like define the race against Johnson as like kind of just being weak. But I guess this is me not giving enough credit to these organizers, but they really like just like honed in on how like this is like a false narrative that Vallas is pushing forward, and here is XYZ issues on why the sum of what Brandon Johnson is running on is an actual public safety. It's a platform for public safety.
How much do you guys think that, Luke, I'll ask you as well. Um, how much do you think that the high profile endorsements that Brandon Johnson got helped, including, well, Bernie Sanders for one, maybe activating some of the youth vote, and we're still getting the numbers on this, but maybe some leftist inclined people within Chicago, but also the Clyburn endorsement, which I was surprised by when it happened a few weeks ago, but that carries some weight and might carry some weight as well with maybe some donors or people outside who want to support Brandon Johnson. What's your read on how the nationalization of the race with those high profile endorsements worked in Johnson's favor, or if it was more just kind of neutral?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think as we've said, the main takeaway is the local ground game that they ran, but I think there's no doubt that those national endorsements definitely helped. With Clyburn's endorsement in particular, I mean, it's been proven that he has pull outside of South Carolina, such as when, he kind of intervened in the Ohio race with Nina Turner.
Mm-hmm.
So I think people did expect that was going to definitely carry sway with Black voters on the south side of Chicago, which, by the way, Brandon Johnson, as far as we know now, it seems won almost 80% of those voters, which was going to be crucial for him. So that's definitely part of what carried him to victory. I will say also on the other side of this, there were high profile national endorsements that came in for Vallas, of course, towards the later stretch of the race, Senator Dick Durbin, and also Obama's former education secretary, Arne Duncan, none of which, really ended up flipping the race. So I think another takeaway we probably should have is there's a way of reading this that, Johnson's victory kind of represents kind of the waning power of Obama world, perhaps on the Democratic Party.
That's interesting. I mean, that, and encouraging, given, Rahm Emanuel has screwed off to his ambassador position.
Right.
I would say that a lot of people, I would nationally consider him a joke if you're on the progressive left, and in Chicago, definitely anything that Rahm Emanuel probably has touched turns to shit because of his widely panned and disastrous record in the city. And so was that a part of Johnson's strategy? Did he try to tie Vallas to the old Obama political machine? Because Vallas has been around for a while, and his ambitions to be mayor have been widely recorded. So because he's tried it before. I mean, was that a part of some of the messaging that was seen on the ground in Chicago? Either of you guys can take this.
Yeah. Well, so just one quick point, and I'll let Jarod go. But in a direct way, you're actually completely right. So the attack was mainly directed at Lori Lightfoot during the primary. But, while all the other candidates were hitting her on, rising crime rates and such, Brandon Johnson criticized her very specifically on a set of mental health facilities that had been closed under Rahm Emanuel as part of this sort of broader austerity program across the city that Lightfoot had run on reopening in her race in 2019 and hadn't done so. And so that was, kind of part of his strategy and answer to the crime question. And he had this whole lane to himself of saying, why isn't the city investing in mental health facilities instead?
Yeah, I actually forgot about that little bit from the earlier race. That was a good point.
Right. So I mean that is notable, obviously, as you guys say. So in terms of the ground game and organizing, what did you observe as some of the most effective tactics? We know some of that going door to door, actually having face-to-face interaction with people can make all the difference in these kinds of races. But I know there were a variety of different groups organizing and doing work on behalf of Brandon Johnson. I mentioned the Working Families Party earlier. I think the Chicago Teachers Union endorsement, naturally massive, and a good repudiation of some of the national rhetoric we've seen directed at them for choosing to stand up for their rights in classroom environments that weren't necessarily safe due to COVID. What's your read on where the organizing was most effective and which organizations were doing the real heroic work of knocking on doors and making this case?
One of the people that we quoted in the story, Rocio Garcia, she's with United Working Families, and she's the one who really just was able to assemble a crew of volunteers who were going door knocking. But it didn't make it into the final piece. But there was one anecdote she was telling us about how earlier in the race that to take a step back, the Illinois Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, their endorsement behind Vallas was that he's going to be anti-small business, that we need economic development. Economic development will bring down crime, sort of thing. But when I was talking to Rocio, she was telling me that I was like, what's your reaction to this idea that Brandon Johnson doesn't support small business? And she's telling me about how there's this kind of a flea market outdoor sort of mall thing that has a lot of vendors who one could arguably say that they are the bedrock of small business. These people don't really have a they don't have a full storefront. So these are the most entrepreneurial types in the city, and that these people did not have any contact with the Illinois Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, who's supposedly supposed to be the ones representing them, but instead they had somebody like Brandon Johnson who's trying to talk with them and build relationships. So I think it's finding or identifying that in this case the Latino community, they're not just this universal group, that there's little sections to it, and going exactly to where they're at.
Gotcha. Luke, you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I mean, I think specifically when it comes to the organizing strategies that the Johnson campaign deployed specifically to court, Latino voters who were going to be really the swing vote in this race. Some of the backstory here is that the infamous political machine in Chicago had for decades run a very explicit strategy of trying to bridge white voters and Latino voters in the city to, functionally offset the majority Black majority at the time in the city. And the system was fashioned by the young Mayor Daley in the 90s, who founded the Hispanic Democratic Organization. And the way it worked was that they essentially would hand out, city jobs to unemployed Latinos in exchange for sort of political support. And there was a huge federal investigation against the organization in the early 2000s that, led to several members of the organization going to jail. And officially, the Hispanic Democratic Organization disbanded. But, if you talk to people on the ground, that infrastructure has still kind of lasted. But now there's a younger generation of, sort of politically involved, Latinos, and they have their own sort of political network. So this was really a kind of, a clash between the two to see who would win out.
Gotcha. And lastly here, Paul Vallas as a figure in Chicago, can you explain, either of you, what his history has been and where you think his brand of politics goes from here? Because I know he, for example, has been was instrumental in school closures outside of Chicago and other cities. This seems to be a bit of the mercenary quality that he brought to this race, but obviously they're going to have to regroup behind another more conservative Democratic candidate next time around. It's just, what does his loss really say about that brand of politics, particularly when it comes to his position on schools, which is so so foundational to his background in politics? Either way, either one of you guys, go ahead.
Yeah, so Paul Vallas was the CEO of the public school system in Chicago, and had also been the budget director going back actually for the young Mayor Daley that I mentioned before. So that was also part of his origins. But in Chicago under Vallas's reign, there were a number of school closures and the promotion of charter schools, and that had generally, I think, been the trend. For Vallas's management style in New Orleans post Katrina, and also in Philadelphia. There was another high profile clash that people had mentioned during the race that Vallas really got hit for more or less not paying out full pension plans to teachers and other city staff as well. In Philadelphia, Vallas had also initiated sort of outsourcing of custodial staff at school. So that was his brand of kind of privatization. And I think that the Johnson campaign very effectively kind of rebutted that and made that a focus of their campaign, and voters responded.
It's like, who could have imagined that austerity is unpopular? I think that's kind of the big thing from it all. The
big takeaway. Right. Well, thank you guys so much for your time today. Jarod Facundo, Luke Goldstein, writing fellows at the American Prospect. You can read their work about this piece in particular on the Chicago race over at the American Prospect. Thank you guys so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
All right. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having us.
Yep.